In the misty village of St. Aldwyn's, a sacred ceremony turns deadly when Father Edmund collapses, poisoned by a revered chalice that shatters on the church floor. Hercule Poirot, the brilliant detective, steps into a web of secrets where a proud widow, a nervous deacon, and a cunning stranger hide motives of greed, shame, and betrayal. As whispers of a missing bequest and stolen funds unravel, Poirot's grey cells uncover a chilling truth. One among them feared exposure enough to kill. Can he piece together the fragments of this sacred mystery before the truth is lost forever? Chapter 1. The Sacred Silence. The village of St. Aldwyn's lay cradled in the gentle folds of the Gloucestershire hills, its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the soft grey light of an autumn dawn. Mist clung to the hedgerows, and the air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves. At the heart of the village stood St. Mary's Church, its weathered stone tower rising like a silent guardian over centuries of worship. On this particular morning, the feast of St. Michael, the church was alive with anticipation. The congregation, a modest assembly of villagers in their Sunday best, filled the ancient pews, their murmurs hushed as they awaited the solemn blessing of the chalice, a silver relic etched with intricate vines and crosses, said to have been crafted in the days of the Crusades. Hercule Poirot, that diminutive detective of impeccable attire and unrivaled intellect, sat in the rearmost pew, his polished shoes gleaming faintly in the dim light. He had come to St. Aldwyn's at the insistence of his friend, Captain Arthur Hastings, who had spoken glowingly of the village's charm and the restorative powers of its countryside. "A little rest, Poirot," Hastings had said, "away from the clamour of London." Poirot, ever sceptical of rural idols, had agreed with a sigh, his curiosity piqued by the promise of a historic ceremony. Now, as he adjusted his perfectly knotted tie, his sharp green eyes scanned the congregation, noting the subtle tensions beneath their pious composure. Father Edmund, the priest, stood at the altar, his white vestments glowing softly in the flicker of beeswax candles. A man of middle age, with a kind face and a voice that carried both warmth and authority, he was beloved by his flock. He raised the chalice with steady hands, its silver surface catching the light as he intoned the ancient blessing. The congregation leaned forward, reverent, as he brought the chalice to his lips and sipped the sacramental wine. For a moment, all was still. Then a shadow passed over Father Edmund's face. His eyes widened, his breath caught in a ragged gasp, and his hands trembled violently. The chalice slipped from his grasp, striking the stone floor with a piercing crash, its fragments scattering like shards of starlight. Father Edmund clutched his chest, staggered, and collapsed, his body crumpling beside the ruined relic. A collective cry rose from the pews. Women clutched their prayer books, men leapt to their feet. Hastings, seated beside Poirot, muttered, "Good Lord, what's happened?" But Poirot was already rising, his movements precise, his expression one of intense focus. "Remain calm, mon ami," he murmured, though his eyes were fixed on the altar. The verger, a stooped figure named Mr. Cobb, rushed forward, only to halt at the sight of the priest's lifeless form. A young deacon, Thomas Lyle, emerged from the vestry, his face pale as he knelt beside Father Edmund, futilely searching for a pulse. From the front pew, Mrs. Clara Wentworth, a formidable widow whose donations had restored the church's roof, let out a sharp cry and clutched her rosary. Beside her, a stranger, Mr. Victor Hargrove, a man of sleek manners and dark eyes who had arrived in the village only days before, stood motionless, his gaze flickering to the shattered chalice. Poirot noted this, his mind already cataloguing the details. The faint, unnatural sheen on the spilled wine, the precise angle of the chalice fragments, the curious hesitation in Deacon Lyle's movements. As the congregation dissolved into chaos, Inspector Grayson, a burly man with a moustache to rival Poirot's own, stormed into the church, his boots echoing on the flagstones. "Nobody leaves!" he bellowed, gesturing to his constables to guard the doors. He knelt briefly by the body, then rose, his face grim. "Poison," he muttered, loud enough for Poirot to hear. "The poor man's been poisoned." Poirot stepped forward, his cane tapping lightly on the floor. "Monsieur l'inspecteur," he said, his voice soft but commanding, "permit me to observe. I am Hercule Poirot." Grayson's eyes narrowed, but he nodded, recognizing the name. Poirot knelt beside the chalice's fragments, his gloved fingers hovering over the silver shards. "This," he said quietly to Hastings, who had joined him, "is no mere accident. The chalice was broken with intent, to conceal something, perhaps the very method of the crime." The church fell silent, save for the distant toll of the bell, as if mourning the violation of its sanctity. Poirot's grey cells, those remarkable instruments of deduction, were already at work, weaving together the threads of a tragedy that would soon unravel the secrets of St. Aldwyn's. Chapter 2. The Shattered Relic. The mist that cloaked St. Aldwyn's had thickened by the time Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings stepped into the nave of St. Mary's Church, where the air was heavy with the scent of wax and the lingering shock of tragedy. The congregation had been ushered out, their faces pale and their whispers frantic, leaving the ancient stone walls to echo with the weight of silence. Inspector Grayson's constables stood sentinel at the oak doors, their boots scuffing the worn flagstones as they ensured no one disturbed the scene. The altar, once a beacon of reverence, now bore the grim tableau of Father Edmund's body, covered hastily with a white cloth, and the scattered fragments of the sacred chalice glinting dully in the flickering candlelight. Poirot, his small frame immaculate in a tailored overcoat, moved with deliberate grace towards the altar. His moustache, meticulously groomed, quivered slightly as he absorbed the scene. Hastings, trailing behind, mopped his brow with a handkerchief, his honest face creased with unease. "Ghastly business, Poirot," he muttered. "A priest, of all people, struck down in his own church. It's unthinkable." "Unthinkable, perhaps, mon ami," Poirot replied, his voice low and precise, "but not impossible. The human heart, it is capable of great darkness, even in a place of light." He knelt beside the chalice's fragments, his gloved fingers hovering over the silver shards without touching them. The chalice, once a masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship, was now a ruin, its bowl cracked, its stem twisted, its engravings marred by the violence of its fall. Poirot's keen eyes traced the edges of the largest fragment, noting a faint, oily sheen on the inner rim, where the sacramental wine had pooled before spilling onto the stone floor. "This sheen," he murmured. "It is not natural. There is something chemical." Inspector Grayson, a man whose broad shoulders and bristling moustache suggested a preference for action over subtlety, approached with a scowl. "Monsieur Poirot," he said gruffly, "I've heard of your reputation, but this is my patch. Poison, the coroner says. Cyanide, likely in the wine. quick and deadly. We're testing the chalice now, but it's a mess. Whoever did this didn't want us poking about." Poirot rose, his movements fluid despite the gravity of the moment. "Précisément, Inspector. The chalice was not merely dropped. It was shattered with purpose, to obscure, to destroy evidence. But Hercule Poirot, he does not permit the truth to be so easily broken." His eyes gleamed with the quiet intensity of a man whose mind was already weaving a tapestry of clues. Grayson grunted, unimpressed, but pragmatic. "We've got 3 likely suspects so far. Mrs. Clara Wentworth, that wealthy widow who's always fussing about the church. She was in the vestry before the service, arranging hymnals or some such. Then there's Deacon Thomas Lyle, Father Edmund's right-hand man. Nervous chap, always twitching. He was helping with the ceremony. And a stranger, Victor Hargrove, some sort of scholar, poking about the village. He was in the front pew, watching everything." Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile. "A widow, a deacon, and a stranger. A most intriguing trinity. Tell me, Inspector, what do you know of their movements?" Grayson gestured toward the vestry, a small room off the chancel where the clergy prepared for services. "Come see for yourself. That's where the chalice was kept before the ceremony. Locked cabinet, usually, but Lyle had the key today." The vestry was a cramped, dimly lit space, its walls lined with shelves of hymnals and vestments. A narrow window, its stained glass depicting St. Michael slaying the dragon, cast a kaleidoscope of colours across a wooden table. On the table stood the cabinet, its lock intact, but its door slightly ajar. Poirot examined it, noting the absence of forced entry. "The key, Inspector," he said. "Who had access to it?" "Lyle, primarily," Grayson replied. "Father Edmund trusted him with it. Mrs. Wentworth's been known to tidy up in here, though. And Hargrove, well, he's been sniffing around the church all week, claiming an interest in its history." Poirot's gaze drifted to a small silver tray on the table, where a decanter of sacramental wine stood, its stopper loose. He leaned closer, his nostrils flaring slightly. "The wine. It was poured from this decanter, oui?" Grayson nodded. Poirot's fingers, still gloved, traced the air above the decanter's rim. And yet, the poison was in the chalice, not the wine itself. Curious, non? The poisoner, he was precise. He wished only Father Edmund to suffer. Hastings, who had been hovering near the door, ventured a thought. "Could it have been an accident, Poirot? Some cleaning solution, perhaps, mistaken for wine?" Poirot's eyes twinkled with gentle reproach. "Mon cher Hastings, you are ever the optimist. Cyanide is not a household cleaner. It is a deliberate choice, administered with malice. No, this was murder, and the breaking of the chalice was no mere clumsiness. It was an act to conceal the method, or perhaps to distract." Grayson's constable, a young man with a nervous habit of adjusting his helmet, entered with a preliminary report. "Sir, the labs confirmed cyanide on the chalice's rim. Traces in the spilled wine, too, but not in the decanter. Whoever did this coated the chalice itself." Poirot nodded, as if this confirmed a suspicion. "And so, the poisoner had access to the chalice in the moments before the ceremony. We must reconstruct the timeline. Tell me, Inspector, who was in the church this morning?" Grayson consulted his notebook. The service began at 8. Father Edmund arrived at 7, with Lyle. Mrs. Wentworth was here by 7:30, fussing in the vestry. Hargrove arrived just before the congregation, around 7:45. The verger, old Cobb, was here all morning, tending the candles and such. Poirot's moustache twitched. And the congregation. They were seated before the chalice was brought to the altar? Aye, Grayson said. No one approached the altar during the service, except Lyle, who handed Father Edmund the chalice. Poirot paced slowly, his cane tapping a rhythmic counterpoint to his thoughts. Then the poison was applied in the vestry, or perhaps during the brief moment the chalice was carried to the altar. We must speak with these three. Monsieur, Lyle, Madame Wentworth, and Monsieur Hargrove. But first, let us examine the scene more closely. He returned to the altar, where the fragments of the chalice lay scattered like a broken constellation. The largest piece, part of the bowl, bore the faint sheen Poirot had noted earlier. He beckoned Grayson to bring a magnifying glass, which the inspector produced with a grumble. Under the lens, the sheen revealed itself as a thin, crystalline residue, barely visible to the naked eye. This, Poirot said, is the signature of the poisoner's hand. Cyanide, applied with care, perhaps with a brush or cloth. But why break the chalice? To destroy this residue, perhaps, or to create a spectacle that would divert attention. Hastings, ever practical, frowned. But Poirot, wouldn't breaking it draw more attention? Everyone saw it shatter. Précisément, Poirot said, his eyes narrowing. It is a paradox, is it not? The act of destruction is both concealment and performance. The poisoner wished us to focus on the chalice's ruin, not its contents. But Hercule Poirot, he sees beyond the spectacle. Grayson, growing impatient, crossed his arms. So, what's your theory, then? Who's your bet, Lyle, Wentworth, or Hargrove? Poirot raised a finger. Patience, Inspector. To name a culprit now would be to pluck a fruit before it is ripe. First, we gather the facts. Let us begin with the vestry, where the chalice rested before its final journey. They returned to the vestry, where Poirot's attention fell on a small, overlooked detail, a crumpled cloth tucked behind a stack of hymnals. He retrieved it with a pair of tweezers, holding it to the light. The cloth was stained, not with wine, but with a faint, acrid odour that made Hastings wrinkle his nose. Good heavens, Poirot! Is that? Cyanide, perhaps, Poirot said. It must be tested, but I suspect this is the tool of our poisoner. Carelessly discarded, or perhaps deliberately hidden to be retrieved later. He handed it to Grayson, who bagged it with a nod. Poirot then turned to the cabinet, examining its lock with minute care. No scratches, no signs of tampering. The key, then, is the key. He smiled at his own pun, though neither Grayson nor Hastings appreciated the levity. Monsieur Lyle had this key, you say, but could another have obtained it? A duplicate, perhaps, or a moment of inattention? Grayson shook his head. Lyle's fastidious about that key. Keeps it on a chain, never lets it out of his sight. Father Edmund trusted him implicitly. Trust, Poirot mused, is a fragile thing, like our chalice. Let us see what Monsieur Lyle has to say. They found Deacon Thomas Lyle in the churchyard, pacing beneath an ancient yew tree, his lanky frame hunched against the chill. His face, pale and drawn, betrayed a man wrestling with his conscience. Poirot approached, his demeanour courteous but unyielding. Monsieur Lyle, a word, if you please. You were with Father Edmund this morning, preparing the chalice. Tell me, what did you observe? Lyle's hands fidgeted with his rosary, the beads clicking nervously. I helped Father set up, as always. I polished the chalice, filled the decanter, laid out the vestments. Everything was normal. Normal, Poirot repeated, his tone deceptively mild. "And yet a man is dead, and the chalice is destroyed. You handled it, did you not? Did you notice anything unusual? Its weight, its surface?" Lyle's eyes darted to the ground. "It was, as it always was, heavy, cold. I handed it to father just before the blessing. I didn't see anything wrong." Poirot's gaze was unrelenting. "And the key to the cabinet? It was in your possession at all times?" "Yes," Lyle said quickly, too quickly. "I never let it out of my sight." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "Merci, monsieur. We shall speak again." As Lyle hurried away, Poirot turned to Hastings. "He is afraid, mon ami. But of what? Guilt or something else?" Their next stop was Mrs. Clara Wentworth, whom they found in the vicarage parlour, serving tea with a trembling hand. She was a woman of late middle age, her severe black dress softened by a lace collar, her eyes sharp but shadowed with grief. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice tight, "this is a terrible day. Father Edmund was a saint. Who could do such a thing?" "That, madame, is what I intend to discover," Poirot said, accepting a cup but not drinking. "You were in the vestry this morning, preparing hymnals. Did you see the chalice?" Mrs. Wentworth's lips pursed. "I saw it in the cabinet, where it belongs. I didn't touch it. My work was with the hymnals and the altar linens." "And yet," Poirot said, leaning forward, "you were alone in the vestry for some time. Did you see Deacon Lyle, or perhaps Monsieur Hargrove?" Her eyes flickered, but she held his gaze. "Lyle was in and out, fussing as usual. I didn't see Hargrove. That man's a stranger here, always asking questions about the church. I don't trust him." Poirot smiled thinly. "Trust, madame, is a rare commodity today. Tell me, did Father Edmund seem himself this morning?" Mrs. Wentworth hesitated, her fingers tightening on her teacup. "He was distracted. He spoke of the chalice, said it carried the weight of history. I thought he meant its age. But now—" Her voice trailed off, and Poirot noted the faint flush in her cheeks. Their final interview was with Victor Hargrove, whom they met at the village inn, the Golden Lamb. He lounged in a leather chair, a glass of sherry in hand, his dark eyes assessing Poirot with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice smooth, "I'm merely a visitor, drawn by the chalice's legend. A tragedy. Its destruction." "Indeed," Poirot said, settling opposite him. "You were in the church last evening, were you not? The verger says the doors were locked." Hargrove's smile didn't waver. "I walked the grounds, admiring the architecture. The church was closed, so I returned to the inn." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And this morning you watched the ceremony closely. Did you notice anything amiss?" Hargrove sipped his sherry. "Only that Father Edmund seemed unsteady before he drank. I thought it nerves, but then—" He shrugged, a gesture too casual for Poirot's liking. As they left the inn, Hastings shook his head. "They're all hiding something, Poirot. Lyle's jumpy, Wentworth's defensive, and Hargrove's too slick by half." Poirot nodded, his mind a whirl of connections. "Each has a secret, mon ami. But only one has the heart of a murderer. The chalice. It is the key, not only to the poison, but to the motive. We must dig deeper, into the shadows of St. Aldwyn's." The mist had begun to lift, revealing the church's tower against a pale sky. Poirot stood for a moment, gazing at it, his grey cells humming with the promise of truth yet to be uncovered. Chapter 3. The Parishioner's Pride. The vicarage of St. Mary's, a squat, ivy-clad building nestled beside the church, exuded an air of faded gentility. Its windows, framed by heavy curtains, glowed softly in the late morning light, casting a warm contrast to the chill that lingered in St. Aldwyn's after the morning's tragedy. Hercule Poirot, accompanied by the ever-faithful Captain Hastings, stepped across the threshold, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the worn Persian rug. The parlour, with its polished mahogany furniture and faint scent of lavender, seemed a sanctuary from the chaos of the church. Yet Poirot's sharp eyes detected an undercurrent of tension in the room's meticulous order. Mrs. Clara Wentworth, the widow whose generosity had preserved St. Mary's through lean years, stood by a silver tea service, her hands trembling as she poured steaming liquid into delicate porcelain cups. She was a woman of commanding presence, her grey hair swept into a severe bun, her black mourning dress relieved only by a cameo brooch at her throat. Her eyes, though reddened with grief, held a spark of defiance as she greeted her visitors. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," she said, her voice steady despite her evident strain. "I trust you've come to make sense of this dreadful affair. Father Edmund was the heart of this village. His loss is unspeakable." Poirot inclined his head, accepting a cup, but placing it untouched on the table. "Madame Wentworth, your devotion to St. Mary's is well known. It is for this reason that I seek your insight. A crime such as this, it is not merely an act of violence, but a violation of the sacred. You were close to Father Edmund. What can you tell me of his state of mind in the days before his death?" Mrs. Wentworth's lips tightened, and she busied herself with the tea tray, arranging spoons with unnecessary precision. He was himself Monsieur Poirot, kind, devoted, perhaps a touch weary. The feast of St. Michael is a grand occasion, and he felt its weight. He spoke often of the chalice, its history, its significance. He believed it bound us to the past, to something greater than ourselves. Poirot's moustache twitched, a subtle sign of his mind at work. "And yet, madame, you say he was weary. Did he speak of any troubles, any sins of the past, perhaps?" Her hand froze, the teaspoon clattering softly against the tray. For a moment her composure faltered, and Poirot noted the fleeting shadow that crossed her face. "Sins," she repeated, her voice sharp. "Father Edmund was a man of God. If he spoke of sin, it was in the way priests do, generalities, exhortations to the flock. Nothing specific." She met his gaze, but her eyes darted briefly to a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. A stern, bearded man in Victorian attire, her late husband, Mr. Reginald Wentworth, whose wealth had funded the church's restoration. Poirot's voice remained gentle, almost soothing. "Madame, you were in the vestry this morning, preparing hymnals, a task of devotion, no doubt, but one that placed you near the chalice. Did you observe anything unusual? Perhaps the deacon, Monsieur Lyle, or the visitor, Monsieur Hargrove?" Mrs. Wentworth's fingers tightened around her teacup. "I was alone, for most of the time, arranging the hymnals and linens. Deacon Lyle came in briefly, muttering about the chalice needing polishing, but he left quickly. I didn't see Hargrove. That man," she hesitated, her tone cooling. "He's an outsider, always asking questions about the church's relics. I told Father Edmund he shouldn't indulge such curiosity, but he was too kind." Hastings, seated stiffly on a velvet-upholstered chair, ventured a question. "Mrs. Wentworth, forgive me, but you seem rather put out by this Hargrove fellow. Did he do something to upset you?" Her eyes flashed. Upset me? No, Captain, but I know his type. Charming, slick, sniffing about for profit. The chalice was priceless, not just in coin, but in spirit. I wouldn't be surprised if he had designs on it. She set her cup down with a clink, her agitation betraying an alibi that Poirot noted was conveniently solitary. Poirot leaned forward, his hands folded neatly over his cane. Madame, let us speak plainly. The chalice was poisoned, its rim coated with cyanide. You were in the vestry, alone, with access to the cabinet. You say you did not touch the chalice, but you felt strongly about its sanctity. Was there perhaps a disagreement with Father Edmund about its care? Mrs. Wentworth's face flushed, and she rose abruptly, her skirts rustling. How dare you, Monsieur Poirot? I loved Father Edmund as a brother in faith. I would never harm him, nor defile the chalice. My husband's legacy is tied to this church. His money rebuilt its very walls. To suggest I would desecrate it. Her voice broke, and she turned to the window, her shoulders rigid. Poirot's expression softened, but his eyes remained piercing. Pardon, madame, but the truth, it is like a fine tapestry. One loose thread, and the whole unravels. You speak of your husband's legacy. Was there something about it that troubled Father Edmund? She spun back, her composure regained, but her voice low. Reginald was a good man, but not without flaws. He left a bequest to Father Edmund for the church's work, a private matter, long settled. If Father was troubled, it was not my doing. Her words were firm, but Poirot detected a tremor of defensiveness, a hint that the bequest was not as settled as she claimed. Hastings, ever the gentleman, tried to ease the tension. Mrs. Wentworth, we're only trying to get to the bottom of this. You must have seen something, anything, that could help. She sighed, sinking back into her chair. I wish I had, Captain, but I was focused on my duties. The vestry was quiet, save for Lyle's comings and goings. He seemed distracted, more than usual. And Father Edmund, he was pacing before the service, muttering about duty and forgiveness. I thought it was just the pressure of the day. Poirot nodded, filing away her words. Merci, madame. Your candour is most helpful. We shall not detain you further. As they rose to leave, his gaze lingered on the photograph of Reginald Wentworth, its heavy silver frame gleaming with polish. Your husband, he was a man of influence. His shadow looms large over St. Aldwyn's, does it not? Mrs. Wentworth's lips parted, but she said nothing, her silence more telling than words. Poirot tipped his hat, and he and Hastings stepped back into the misty air, the vicarage door closing softly behind them. As they walked toward the churchyard, Hastings shook his head. She's a proud woman, Poirot, but I can't see her as a poisoner. All that talk of the chalice and her husband's legacy. She's protective, not malicious. Poirot's eyes twinkled with a knowing glint. Mon ami, pride is a powerful motive. It can drive one to defend a legacy or to conceal a shame. Madame Wentworth guards something, perhaps not murder, but a secret nonetheless. Her alibi? It is too neat, too solitary. And her agitation when I mentioned the bequest, there is a thread to pull. They paused by the church gate, where the yew trees cast long shadows over moss-covered gravestones. Poirot's gaze drifted to the church tower, its bell silent now but resonant with the morning's tragedy. The chalice, he mused. It is more than a relic. It is a symbol, a key to the hearts of those who revered it. Mrs. Wentworth sees it as her husband's legacy, Lyle as his duty, Hargrove as... What? We must uncover what each sought to gain, or to lose by its destruction. Hastings frowned. You think the bequest is tied to the murder? Perhaps, Poirot said, tapping his cane against the ground. Or perhaps it is a distraction, like the shattering of the chalice itself. But one thing is certain, mon ami. In St. Aldwyn's, the past is never truly buried. Come, let us see what the churchyard whispers to Hercule Poirot. They stepped through the gate, the gravel crunching underfoot as the mist swirled around them, carrying the faint echo of a village forever altered by a single, fatal sip. Chapter 4. The Deacon's Burden. The churchyard of St. Mary's, with its ancient yews and weathered gravestones, seemed to hold its breath as Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings made their way through the mist-shrouded paths. The air was damp, carrying the faint tang of earth and decay, and the distant toll of a single bell lingered like a mournful afterthought. Poirot's polished shoes clicked softly on the gravel, his cane a steady rhythm against the silence, while Hastings, ever the loyal companion, kept pace, his brow furrowed with the weight of the morning's tragedy. Their destination was Deacon Thomas Lyle, the nervous young man whose role in the ceremony placed him at the heart of the mystery surrounding Father Edmund's death and the Shattered Chalice. They found Lyle near the lich gate, his lanky frame hunched as he clutched a rosary, its beads slipping through his fingers with a restless urgency. His face, pale and drawn, bore the marks of sleeplessness, and his eyes darted toward the church tower as if expecting judgment to descend. Poirot, his expression one of courteous inquiry, approached with a slight bow. Monsieur Lyle, a moment of your time, if you please. The events of this morning, they are most distressing, and Hercule Poirot seeks to bring a clarity to this darkness. Lyle's hands stilled, though the rosary trembled slightly. Monsieur Poirot, he said, his voice thin and strained, I've told Inspector Grayson all I know. I helped Father Edmund prepare for the service, as I always do. I can't believe he's gone. His gaze dropped to the ground, avoiding Poirot's piercing green eyes. Poirot's moustache twitched, a subtle sign of his mind at work. Oui, monsieur, your grief is evident. But let us speak of the chalice, that sacred relic now in fragments. You were tasked with its care, were you not? You polished it, you placed it in Father Edmund's hands. Tell me, what did you observe? Lyle's fingers resumed their nervous dance with the rosary. It was, as it always was, heavy, cold, beautiful. I polished it in the vestry, checked the wine in the decanter, and handed it to Father just before the blessing. I didn't notice anything wrong. I swear it. His voice cracked on the last word, and he looked away, toward the mist-veiled church. Poirot's tone remained gentle, almost soothing, but his words were precise as a surgeon's scalpel. And yet, monsieur, the chalice was poisoned, its rim coated with cyanide. You had access to it, alone in the vestry. You held the key to the cabinet. Did you perhaps see anyone else near the chalice, Madame Wentworth, or the visitor, Monsieur Hargrove? Lyle's head snapped up, his eyes wide with something akin to panic. No one. I mean, Mrs. Wentworth was in the vestry earlier, arranging hymnals, but she didn't touch the chalice. And Hargrove, I didn't see him at all. He's always lurking about, asking questions about the church, but not this morning. His words tumbled out too quickly, and Poirot noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow despite the autumn chill. Hastings, standing a step behind, interjected with his characteristic directness. Look here, Lyle, you seem awfully jumpy. If you're innocent, why do you look like a man with the devil on his tail?" Lyle's face flushed, and he clutched the rosary so tightly that his knuckles whitened. I'm just shaken, Captain. Father Edmund was like a father to me. I've served this church for years, given everything to it. To think someone could do this." He trailed off, his voice breaking, but Poirot's gaze remained unrelenting. "Monsieur Lyle," Poirot said, stepping closer, "you speak of devotion, yet there are whispers in the village. A villager tells me you argued with Father Edmund last week, something about a matter of trust. What was this matter, if I may ask?" Lyle's eyes widened, and for a moment he seemed poised to flee. Then his shoulders sagged, as if the weight of the question pressed him into submission. "It was nothing," he muttered. "A misunderstanding. Father thought I'd been careless with some church funds, petty cash for candles and such. I explained it was a mistake, a mix-up with the accounts. He believed me." But his voice lacked conviction, and Poirot's grey cells hummed with the certainty that Lyle was withholding something. "Carelessness with funds," Poirot repeated, his tone deceptively mild. "A small matter, perhaps, but trust is the foundation of a church, no? Did Father Edmund speak of this to anyone else? Madame Wentworth, perhaps?" Lyle shook his head vehemently. "No, he wouldn't. He was private about such things. He said he'd handle it himself." His eyes darted to the church, then back to Poirot, and the detective noted the flicker of fear in them. Poirot's smile was thin, but courteous. "Merci, Monsieur Lyle. You have been most helpful. But a word of advice. The truth, it is like a shadow. It follows you, even when you turn away." He tipped his hat, and Lyle, muttering something incoherent, hurried off toward the village, his footsteps uneven on the gravel path. As they watched him go, Hastings shook his head. "He's hiding something, Poirot. That business about the funds. It doesn't ring true, and he's nervous as a cat in a thunderstorm." "Précisément, mon ami," Poirot said, his eyes narrowing as he gazed after Lyle's retreating figure. "Monsieur Lyle carries a burden, one heavier than grief. But is it the burden of guilt or merely fear? We must learn more of this misunderstanding with Father Edmund. The church funds, they may be a thread to pull." They turned back toward the church, where Inspector Grayson was overseeing the removal of Father Edmund's body, now respectfully covered and placed on a stretcher. The inspector caught sight of them and strode over, his face etched with frustration. "Monsieur Poirot, I've just had word from the lab. The cyanide was definitely on the chalice's rim, applied with something like a cloth or brush. We found that stained cloth you spotted in the vestry. It's got traces of cyanide, all right. Looks like our poisoner was sloppy." Poirot's lips curved slightly. "Sloppy, Inspector? Or clever? To leave such a cloth in plain sight, it is either carelessness or a deliberate misdirection. Tell me, what do you know of Deacon Lyle's argument with Father Edmund?" Grayson scratched his chin. "Heard about that, did you? Old Cobb, the verger, mentioned it. Said he overheard Lyle and the priest in the vestry last week, voices raised. Something about money, though Cobb didn't catch the details. Lyle's been jumpy ever since, apparently." Poirot nodded, his mind cataloguing the information. "And Madame Wentworth, or Monsieur Hargrove, did they have any such disputes with Father Edmund?" "Not that we've heard," Grayson said. "Wentworth's always been a bit high-handed, mind you, throwing her weight around because of her husband's money. Hargrove's a mystery, keeps to himself. but the innkeeper says he's been asking about the chalice's history, claiming it's worth a fortune." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A fortune, you say? Interesting. The chalice, it is a magnet for many desires, devotion, greed, perhaps even shame. We must tread carefully, Inspector, for the truth lies in the shadows of these desires." They returned to the vestry, where the air felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves bore witness to the crime. Poirot examined the cabinet once more, his gloved fingers tracing the lock's smooth surface. "No tampering," he murmured. "The key, it is the heart of the matter. Monsieur Lyle guards it jealously, yet the poisoner reached the chalice. How, unless Lyle himself is our man, or someone gained his trust?" Hastings, peering over Poirot's shoulder, frowned. "Could someone have slipped in while Lyle was distracted? The vestry's not exactly Fort Knox." Poirot shook his head. "Non, mon ami. The poison was applied with precision in the brief window before the ceremony. The poisoner knew the chalice's movements, its handling. This points to someone intimate with the church's routines, Lyle, perhaps, or Madame Wentworth. Hargrove, he is an outsider, but his interest in the chalice cannot be ignored." As they stepped back into the churchyard, the mist was beginning to lift, revealing the stark outline of St. Mary's Tower against a pale sky. Poirot paused, his cane planted firmly in the ground. The deacon's burden, it is not merely the loss of Father Edmund. It is something deeper, something that ties him to the chalice and its destruction. We must uncover this matter of trust, and whether it drove him to murder. Hastings nodded, though his expression was skeptical. "Lyle doesn't strike me as a killer, Poirot. He's too, well, weak. But I suppose you'll say that's exactly why he might do it." Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "The weak, mon ami, can be the most dangerous when cornered. Come, let us see what Monsieur Hargrove, the stranger with an eye for relics, has to reveal. The pieces of this puzzle, they begin to take shape, but the picture is far from complete." They set off toward the village inn, the weight of the mystery settling around them like the fading mist as Poirot's grey cells worked tirelessly to unravel the secrets of St. Aldwyn's. Chapter 5. The Stranger's Shadow. The Golden Lamb, the sole inn of St. Aldwyn's, stood at the village's heart, its timbered facade and glowing windows a beacon of warmth against the encroaching dusk. The mist had retreated, leaving the cobblestone street slick and reflective under the first stars. Hercule Poirot, his overcoat buttoned against the evening chill, led Captain Hastings through the inn's low doorway, where the scent of wood smoke and ale mingled with the murmur of subdued voices. The tragedy at St. Mary's had cast a pall over the village, and even the inn's usual cheer seemed muted, as if the very walls whispered of the morning's horror. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the taproom, settling on Victor Hargrove, who lounged in a corner by the fire, a glass of sherry cradled in his hand. Hargrove was a man of studied elegance, dark hair slicked back, a tailored suit that spoke of city sophistication, and eyes that held a glint of guarded amusement. He rose as Poirot approached, offering a smile that was equal parts charm and calculation. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice smooth as the sherry he sipped. "And Captain Hastings, I presume. I've heard of your reputation, sir. Come to unravel our little village mystery, have you?" Poirot returned the smile, though his was tinged with a quiet intensity. "Monsieur Hargrove, a murder in a sacred place is no small matter. I seek only the truth, and you, as a visitor to St. Aldwyn's, may have seen something others have missed. Will you indulge me with a few questions?" Hargrove gestured to the chairs opposite him, his movements fluid. "By all means. I'm a stranger here, but I've nothing to hide." His tone was light, but Poirot noted the slight tightening of his fingers around the glass, a telltale sign of wariness. Hastings, settling into a chair with a creak, eyed Hargrove with open suspicion. "You arrived in the village just days ago, Mr. Hargrove. Bit of a coincidence, don't you think, showing up right before a murder?" Hargrove's laugh was soft, almost mocking. "Coincidence, Captain? I'm an antiquarian, drawn to St. Aldwyn's by the fame of its chalice, a 12th century relic, etched with symbols of the Crusades. It's the sort of thing that stirs a scholar's blood. I came to study it, perhaps sketch it. Alas, it's now in pieces." His eyes flickered to Poirot, as if gauging his reaction. Poirot's moustache twitched, a subtle signal of his skepticism. "A scholar, you say? And yet, monsieur, the verger tells me you were seen near the church last evening, after it was locked. A curious time for study, no?" Hargrove's smile didn't waver, but his gaze sharpened. "I was admiring the architecture, Monsieur Poirot. The church is a fine example of Norman design. Those arches, that tower. I walked the grounds, nothing more. The doors were locked, as you say. I returned here afterward." He sipped his sherry, his movements deliberate, but Poirot caught the briefest glance toward the inn's door, as if he longed to escape scrutiny. "Admiring architecture in the dark," Poirot mused, his voice deceptively mild. "Most dedicated. Tell me, Monsieur Hargrove, what was your interest in the chalice? Its historical value, or something more tangible?" Hargrove leaned back, his expression at one of practiced ease. "Historical, of course. A relic like that tells a story. Knights, pilgrims, the weight of centuries. I'd hoped to document it for a monograph I'm writing. Its destruction is a loss to scholarship." His voice carried a note of regret, but Poirot's keen eyes detected a flicker of satisfaction, swiftly concealed. Hastings, never one for subtlety, leaned forward. "Come now, Hargrove, you were in the front pew this morning, watching the ceremony like a hawk. Did you see anything odd? Lyle, Mrs. Wentworth, anyone near the chalice?" Hargrove's fingers traced the rim of his glass. "I saw what everyone did. Father Edmund took the chalice, drank, and fell. Deacon Lyle handed it to him, looking as nervous as a schoolboy. Mrs. Wentworth was in her pew, clutching her prayer book like it might save her soul. Nothing out of the ordinary, until the collapse." He paused, then added, "The chalice, though, it did seem to slip from the priest's hands rather dramatically." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Dramatically, you say? An interesting choice of word. You suggest the fall was not accidental?" Hargrove shrugged, a gesture too casual for Poirot's liking. "I'm no detective, Monsieur Poirot, but it struck me as odd, the way it shattered, almost as if someone wanted it broken." His tone was neutral, but Poirot sensed a probing quality, as if Hargrove were testing the waters. "Précisément," Poirot said, his voice low. "The chalice was broken with purpose, to conceal the poison's trace, perhaps, or to divert attention. You, monsieur, were close enough to see. Did you notice any sheen, perhaps, on the chalice's rim?" Hargrove's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "A sheen? No, I'm afraid not. The candles made everything glint, hard to tell what was what." He set his glass down, his movements careful. "But if you're looking for suspects, I'd wager on Lyle. He was sweating bullets, and he handled the chalice last. Poirot's smile was enigmatic. Merci, Monsieur Hargrove. Your observations are most illuminating. One final question. Had you ever met Father Edmund before this visit? Hargrove shook his head. Never. I spoke to him briefly 2 days ago about the chalice's provenance. He was kind but guarded. Said it was the church's treasure, not to be trifled with. His tone carried a hint of mockery, as if he found such sentiment quaint. Poirot rose, tipping his hat. You have been most cooperative, monsieur. We shall speak again, I think. As he and Hastings stepped back into the tap room, the detective's expression was one of a quiet calculation. This Hargrove, he murmured. He is like a fox, charming, cunning, and always watching. His interest in the chalice, it is not merely academic. There is something he seeks, or something he fears. Hastings, pulling his coat tighter against the evening chill, frowned. He's slippery, I'll give you that. But a murderer? He doesn't seem the type to get his hands dirty. Poirot's eyes twinkled. Mon ami, les mains les plus dangereuses sont celles qui apparaissent propres. Hargrove's alibi. It is as vague as the mist, admiring architecture at night. No, he was near the church for a reason. We must discover what drew him there. They stepped outside, where the village was settling into a hushed evening, the lights of the Golden Lamb casting long shadows across the street. Poirot paused, his gaze drifting toward St. Mary's, its tower a dark silhouette against the starry sky. The chalice, he said softly. It is the key to this puzzle. For Madame Wentworth, it is a symbol of her husband's legacy. For Monsieur Lyle, a duty that weighs heavily. For Hargrove, it is... what? A prize, a threat, or a means to an end? Hastings, ever practical, rubbed his hands together. What's our next move, Poirot? Back to Lyle? He's the one who handled the chalice. Poirot shook his head. No, mon ami. We must cast a wider net. Let us speak with the verger, Monsieur Cobb. He is the silent observer of St. Mary's, and such men often see what others overlook. The stranger's shadow, it stretches far, but it is in the small details that we shall find the truth. They set off toward the verger's cottage, a modest dwelling near the churchyard, as the night closed in around St. Aldwyn's, the mystery of the shattered chalice deepening with every step. Chapter 6. The Poisoned Wine. The evening had settled over St. Aldwyn's like a velvet curtain, the village hushed under a sky pricked with stars. The air was sharp with the scent of frost, and the faint glow from St. Mary's Church cast long, wavering shadows across the churchyard. Hercule Poirot, his overcoat buttoned to the chin, moved with measured steps toward the church, his cane tapping a deliberate rhythm on the cobblestone path. Captain Hastings, ever at his side, hunched his shoulders against the chill, his breath visible in the crisp air. Dashed cold tonight, Poirot, he muttered. Hope this visit to the church yields something. That Hargrove fellow's slippery as an eel, but I'm still not convinced he's our man. Poirot's green eyes glinted in the moonlight, his moustache a perfect crescent beneath his bowler hat. Patience, mon ami. The truth, it is like a fine wine. It reveals itself only with time and care. Monsieur Hargrove casts a shadow, oui, but it is the poison itself that will lead us to the heart of this crime. Let us examine the scene once more, where the chalice met its end. They entered St. Mary's through a side door, the heavy oak creaking under the constable's key. Inside, the nave was a cavern of flickering candlelight, the altar now stripped of its tragic burden. Father Edmund's body had been removed to the coroner's care, but the fragments of the shattered chalice remained, cordoned off by Inspector Grayson's orders. The inspector himself stood near the chancel, his broad frame silhouetted against the stained glass window of Sanct. Michael, his face etched with the weariness of a man grappling with an unthinkable crime. "Monsieur Poirot," Grayson greeted, his voice gruff but tinged with grudging respect. "Back again? The coroner's report just came in, and it's as we thought. Cyanide, fast-acting, coated on the chalice's rim. The wine in the decanter's clean, so the poison was applied directly to the cup. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Poirot nodded, his gaze fixed on the scattered silver shards, their edges catching the candlelight like broken promises. "Précisément, Inspector. The precision of the poison's application, it speaks of intent, of knowledge. The chalice was in the vestry before the ceremony, locked in its cabinet. Only those with access could have tampered with it. Tell me, have you found anything new since our last conversation?" Grayson gestured to a constable, who handed him a small evidence bag. Inside was the crumpled cloth Poirot had discovered in the vestry, its faint, acrid odor now confirmed as cyanide. "This," Grayson said, "was definitely used to apply the poison. Found it tucked behind those hymnals, as you pointed out. Careless of the killer, if you ask me." Poirot's lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile. "Careless, or perhaps deliberate. To leave such a clue, it is either a mistake or a challenge. The poisoner wishes us to see the cloth, perhaps to point us toward another. But to Hercule Poirot, he is not so easily led." He knelt beside the altar, his gloved fingers hovering over the largest fragment of the chalice, its engraved vines marred by the violence of its fall. "The sheen, we observed. It is the cyanide's residue, oui? But there is something else here. Something overlooked." He beckoned Grayson to bring a lantern closer, its light revealing a tiny speck of white powder, barely visible, caught in the chalice's cracked stem. Poirot's eyes gleamed with sudden intensity. "This," he murmured, "is not cyanide. It is something else, perhaps a trace of the cloth's fabric, or another substance used in the crime. Inspector, have this analyzed with utmost care." Grayson, though skeptical, nodded to his constable, who carefully collected the speck with the tweezers. "You think it's significant, then? Could just be dust from the floor." Poirot rose, brushing his gloves with a fastidious flick. "Dust, Inspector, does not cling so precisely to a relic's surface. No, this is a clue, small but vital. The chalice, it tells us more than it conceals." He turned to the vestry door, his mind already reconstructing the moments before the ceremony. "Let us revisit the place where the chalice was prepared. The poisoner's hand was steady, but perhaps not invisible." The vestry, with its narrow window and shelves of hymnals, felt smaller in the dim light, its air thick with the weight of secrets. Poirot's attention returned to the cabinet, its lock unmarred, its key still in Deacon Lyle's possession. He examined the decanter, its ruby wine untouched by poison, and the silver tray, its surface polished to a mirror-like sheen. Then his gaze fell on a small, overlooked object, a vial, no larger than a thimble, wedged beneath a hymn book on the shelf. He retrieved it with his tweezers, holding it to the light. The vial was empty, but a faint crystalline residue clung to its inner surface. "Mon Dieu," Poirot whispered, his voice barely audible. "This is the vessel of death. Cyanide, carried in this tiny container, applied with the cloth we found. And yet it was left here, hidden but not destroyed. Why? Hastings, peering over his shoulder, frowned. Sloppy work, Poirot. Surely the killer would have taken it away. Poirot's eyes narrowed. No, mon ami. This is no accident. The vial was placed here, perhaps to be retrieved later, or to implicate another. The poisoner is cunning, but not infallible. He handed the vial to Grayson, who bagged it with a grunt of surprise. Test this, Inspector. It will confirm the cyanide, but more importantly, it may bear traces of the hand that held it. Grayson scratched his moustache. You're thinking Lyle, aren't you? He had the key, was in here alone with the chalice. Fits like a glove. Poirot raised a finger, his expression cautionary. A glove that fits too well, Inspector, is sometimes a trap. Monsieur Lyle is nervous, oui, but nervousness isn't guilt. Madame Wentworth was also in the vestry, and Monsieur Hargrove, he has a way of appearing where he is not expected. We must consider all possibilities. They stepped back into the nave, where the constable was finishing his sweep of the altar area. Poirot paused, his gaze drifting to the stained-glass window, its depiction of St. Michael slaying the dragon, now a stark reminder of the battle between good and evil played out in this sacred space. The poison, he said softly. It was applied in the vestry, in the moments before the ceremony. The window of opportunity, it is narrow, perhaps 30 minutes, when the chalice was unlocked and prepared. Lyle, Wentworth, Hargrove, all had access in their way, but who had motive? Hastings, ever eager to theorize, ventured a thought. What about that argument Lyle had with Father Edmund, the one about trust and funds? Could be he was stealing, and the priest found out. Poirot nodded, but his expression was guarded. A possibility, mon ami, but not the only one. Madame Wentworth guards her husband's legacy with fierce pride, perhaps too fierce, and Hargrove, his interest in the chalice is more than scholarly, I suspect. We must learn what each stood to gain, or lose, by Father Edmund's death. Grayson, growing impatient, crossed his arms. So, what's your next move, Poirot? We've got the cloth, the vial, the chalice fragments. We're closing in. Poirot's smile was serene, but resolute. We are but at the beginning, Inspector. The poison is the weapon, but the motive is the soul of this crime. Let us seek out the verger, Monsieur Cobb, once more. His eyes, they see much that others miss. And then we shall probe deeper into the shadows cast by our three suspects. As they left the church, the night air seemed to tighten around them, the village of St. Aldwyn's cloaked in a silence that spoke of secrets yet to be unearthed. Poirot's grey cells, ever restless, churned with the certainty that the poisoned wine was but the first thread in a tapestry of deceit, woven by a hand as deliberate as it was desperate. Chapter 7. The Hidden Scandal. The night had deepened over St. Aldwyn's, wrapping the village in a cloak of stillness, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl in the churchyard yews. Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings emerged from St. Mary's Church, their breath visible in the frosty air, as they made their way toward the verger's cottage, a modest stone dwelling tucked behind a hedge of hawthorn. The glow of a single lamp spilled through its window, a beacon in the darkness, promising answers to the questions that swirled in Poirot's meticulous mind. The discovery of the cyanide-laced vial in the vestry had sharpened his focus, but it was the whispers of a scandal, hinted at in Deacon Lyle's nervous demeanour and Mrs. Wentworth's guarded pride, that now drew him forward. Hastings, pulling his scarf tighter, glanced at Poirot. "This business about Lyle and the church funds, Poirot. It's got to be the key. If Father Edmund caught him with his hand in the till, that's motive enough for murder, don't you think?" Poirot's eyes gleamed under the brim of his bowler hat. "Mon ami, a scandal is like a pebble in a pond. It ripples outward, touching many lives. Monsieur Lyle's argument with Father Edmund may indeed be significant, but we must not leap to conclusions. The truth, it hides in the details, and we have yet to uncover them all." His cane tapped softly on the path, a metronome to his thoughts. They reached the verger's cottage, where Mr. Cobb, a stooped figure with a face like weathered parchment, opened the door at their knock. His eyes, roomy but sharp, widened at the sight of Poirot. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "I heard what happened. Terrible, terrible. Come in, please." He ushered them into a cramped parlour, where a fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows over a cluttered table strewn with parish records and a well-worn Bible. Poirot settled into a creaking chair, his posture impeccable despite the late hour. "Monsieur Cobb, you are the eyes and ears of St. Mary's, no? You see what others do not. Tell me, what have you observed of Deacon Lyle, Mrs. Wentworth, and the stranger, Monsieur Hargrove, in the days leading to this tragedy?" Cobb's hands trembled as he poured tea from a chipped pot, his movements slow but deliberate. "I'm no gossip, sir, but I'll tell you what I know. Deacon Lyle, he's a good lad, but troubled of late. Last week I overheard him and Father Edmund in the vestry, voices raised, which ain't like father, him being so gentle. Lyle was saying something about making it right, and father mentioned trust, said it was broken. I didn't catch more, but Lyle's been jumpy since, like a man expecting a storm." Poirot's moustache twitched, a sign of his growing interest. And this matter of trust, what was its nature? Funds, perhaps, as the village whispers? Cobb hesitated, his eyes darting to the fire. "I don't like to speak ill, but there's been talk. The church keeps a small fund for the poor, candles, alms, that sort of thing. Father Edmund noticed some discrepancies a while back, sums not adding up. He asked Lyle about it, private-like, but I reckon he wasn't satisfied with the answers. Lyle swore it was a mistake, but father was, well, disappointed." Hastings leaned forward, his honest face alight with curiosity. "Disappointed enough to sack Lyle, do you think? That'd give him a reason to panic." Cobb shook his head. "Father wasn't one for rash decisions. He'd have given Lyle a chance to make amends. But it weighed on him, I could tell. He was quieter these last days, praying more than usual." Poirot's fingers steepled, his gaze fixed on Cobb. "And Madame Wentworth?" "She is a pillar of the church, yet her pride in her husband's legacy is fierce. Did Father Edmund ever speak of her, or of the bequest she mentioned?" Cobb's lips pursed, and he lowered his voice, as if the walls might overhear. "Mrs. Wentworth's a generous soul, but she's particular about her husband's name. That bequest, it was a tidy sum, meant for an orphanage in Gloucester, but it never reached them. Father Edmund confided in me once, months ago, that he was troubled by it. Said he'd found papers suggesting the money was diverted, though he didn't say how or by whom. He was planning to look into it, quiet-like, so as not to stir up the trouble." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his grey cells humming with the new information. Diverted, you say? And did he share these concerns with anyone else? Monsieur Lyle, perhaps? Cobb nodded slowly. I reckon he did. I saw him and Lyle talking in the churchyard a few days back, looking serious. Mrs. Wentworth, too. She came to the vicarage one evening last week, pressing father about something. I was sweeping the path, heard her say, "It must stay buried, for Reginald's sake." Father looked weary, said he'd do what was right. Hastings whistled softly. Sounds like a proper mess, Poirot. If Wentworth's money was misused, and Father Edmund was digging into it, that's motive for someone to silence him. Poirot's smile was faint, but sharp. Oui, mon ami, but we must tread carefully. A scandal. It can be a smoke-screen as much as a motive. Madame Wentworth guards her husband's name, Monsieur Lyle his position, and Monsieur Hargrove, his purpose remains unclear. Tell me, Monsieur Cobb, what of the stranger? Did he cross paths with Father Edmund? Cobb's face darkened. That Hargrove, he's a queer one. Been poking about the church all week, asking about the chalice, its history, even its value. Father indulged him, showed him the relic once, but I didn't like his manner. Too smooth, like a peddler with something to sell. Last night I saw him near the church after dark, lingering by the gate. I told him it was locked, and he left, but I didn't like the look in his eye. Poirot's expression grew thoughtful. Most interesting. And this morning during the ceremony, where was Monsieur Hargrove? In the front pew, Cobb said promptly. Watching everything, like he was studying a play. Didn't move a muscle when Father fell, just stared at the chalice as it shattered. Poirot rose, his movements fluid despite the cramped parlour. Merci, Monsieur Cobb. Your memory, it is a treasure to Hercule Poirot. One final question. The key to the chalice's cabinet. Did anyone but Deacon Lyle ever handle it? Cobb shook his head firmly. Only Lyle, sir. Father trusted him with it, always. Mrs. Wentworth might tidy the vestry, but she'd no cause to touch the key. Hargrove, he's never been near the cabinet, far as I know. As they stepped back, into the night, the verger's words echoed in Poirot's mind. Hastings, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, broke the silence. This bequest business, Poirot. It's got to be the heart of it. If Wentworth's money was stolen, and Father Edmund was onto it, someone had a reason to stop him. Lyle's the obvious one, with his access and that argument. Poirot's cane tapped a steady rhythm as they walked toward the village inn. Perhaps, mon ami, but the obvious is rarely the truth. Madame Wentworth's fear of disgrace, it is palpable. And Hargrove, his interest in the chalice, suggests a motive we have yet to uncover. The scandal, it binds them all, but it is the poison that reveals the killer's hand. They paused at the churchyard gate, the tower of St. Mary's looming like a silent witness. Poirot's gaze lingered on the darkened windows, his mind weaving the threads of testimony and evidence. "The hidden scandal," he murmured. "It is like the chalice itself. Beautiful, revered but fragile. One crack, and it shatters. We must find that crack, Hastings, before the truth slips away." With the village asleep around them, Poirot's grey cells churned, sensing that the secrets of St. Aldwyn's were closer to the surface than ever before. Chapter 8. The Antiquarian's Motive. The morning sun pierced the lingering mist over St. Aldwyn's, casting a pale glow across the village's cobblestone streets and thatched roofs. Hercule Poirot, his overcoat impeccable despite the early hour, walked with Captain Hastings toward the Golden Lamb, where Victor Hargrove The enigmatic stranger had taken up residence. The inn's sign creaked faintly in the breeze, and the scent of fresh-baked bread from a nearby cottage mingled with the crisp air. Poirot's cane tapped a steady rhythm, his green eyes sharp with purpose, while Hastings, ever the loyal companion, adjusted his hat and muttered about the chill. "Poirot," Hastings said, his voice low, "this Hargrove fellow's too smooth for my liking. All that talk about being an antiquarian, studying the chalice, sounds like a cover to me. What's a man like that doing in a sleepy place like St. Aldwyn's?" Poirot's moustache curved slightly, a sign of his amusement at Hastings' bluntness. "Mon ami, you are correct to suspect. Monsieur Hargrove, he wears his charm like a mask, but behind it lies a purpose. The chalice, it draws him like a moth to a flame. But is it greed or something deeper? We shall see." His tone was light, but his eyes held the intensity of a hunter closing in on his quarry. They entered the inn, where the tap-room was quiet, save for a serving maid polishing glasses behind the counter. Hargrove sat at his usual corner table, a newspaper spread before him, though his eyes were fixed on the window, as if watching the village beyond. He rose as Poirot approached, his smile polished but guarded. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," he said, gesturing to the chairs opposite. "An early visit. I trust you've made progress in your investigation." Poirot settled into a chair, his movements precise. "Progress, Monsieur Hargrove, is like a mosaic. Each piece must be placed with care. You, as a scholar of antiquities, will appreciate the need for precision. Let us speak plainly. Your interest in the chalice, it is more than academic, none?" Hargrove's smile tightened, but he leaned back, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup. "I've told you, Monsieur Poirot, I'm an antiquarian. The chalice was a rare artifact, 12th century silver, Crusader origins. I came to study it, perhaps to broker its inclusion in a museum collection. Its destruction is a tragedy." His voice was smooth, but Poirot noted the slight flicker in his eyes, a hint of unease. Hastings, never one for subtlety, leaned forward. "Study it, or steal it? You were seen lurking near the church after dark, Hargrove. Locked or not, you were up to something." Hargrove's laugh was soft, almost dismissive. "Lurking, Captain. I was admiring the architecture, as I said. The church is a gem, even at night. As for stealing, I'm no thief. I deal in legitimate transactions. Ask anyone in London's antiquities circles. Victor Hargrove is a respected name." Poirot's gaze was unrelenting, his voice deceptively gentle. "A respected name, perhaps, but not without shadows. I have made inquiries, monsieur. A contact in London informs me you are no stranger to the black market. You have inquired about the chalice's value, not for a museum, but for private collectors. Is this not so?" Hargrove's composure faltered for a moment, his fingers tightening on the cup. "You've been busy, Monsieur Poirot. Very well, I'll be frank. The chalice was valuable, priceless even. I did explore its market potential, but only hypothetically. I never intended to steal it. Father Edmund was open to discussing its history, but he was firm about keeping it in the church. I respected that." Poirot's moustache twitched, a sign of his skepticism. "Respected, you say? Yet you were near the church the night before the murder, and you watched the ceremony with a most attentive eye. Did you see anything unusual? Monsieur Lyle, perhaps, or Madame Wentworth?" Hargrove sipped his coffee, his movements deliberate. "Lyle was nervous, as I said before. He fumbled with the chalice when he handed it to Father Edmund, almost dropped it. Mrs. Wentworth was in her pew, looking as if she'd swallowed a lemon. Nothing else caught my eye, except— He paused, his gaze sharpening. The chalice did seem to shine oddly, just before Father drank. I thought it was the candlelight, but now you mention poison. Poirot leaned forward, his voice low. A sheen, monsieur. You did not mention this before. Describe it, if you please. Hargrove shrugged, though his nonchalance seemed forced. A faint glint, oily. Perhaps. Hard to say in the dim light. I'm no chemist, Monsieur Poirot. If it was poison, I didn't see who applied it. His eyes met Poirot's, challenging, but Poirot merely smiled. Most interesting, Poirot said. You see, the cyanide was applied to the chalice's rim with a cloth we found in the vestry. You, monsieur, were not in the vestry, but your presence near the church raises questions. Did you, perhaps, seek to acquire the chalice by other means? Hargrove's smile returned, colder now. You're fishing, Monsieur Poirot. I'm a businessman, not a murderer. If I wanted the chalice, I'd have negotiated, not poisoned a priest. Look to Lyle. He had the key, the access, and that argument with Father Edmund. Or Mrs. Wentworth, with her obsession over her husband's legacy. I'm just a visitor, caught in the wrong place. Poirot rose, his expression serene, but his eyes piercing. A visitor, monsieur, but one with a keen interest in relics. The chalice, it was a prize worth killing for, none. Or perhaps a threat to someone's secrets. We shall speak again. He tipped his hat, and he and Hastings stepped back into the tap-room, leaving Hargrove to his coffee and his carefully crafted facade. Outside, the village was stirring, villagers casting wary glances toward the church. Hastings shook his head. He's a cool customer, Poirot. Admits to sniffing around the chalice's value, but denies everything else. Do you think he's our man? Poirot's cane tapped the cobblestones as they walked toward the churchyard. Hargrove. He is a man of shadows, mon ami. His motive, it is tied to the chalice's worth. But murder, it is too crude for his nature. Yet his presence at the church, his knowledge of the black market, these are threads we cannot ignore. He may not have poisoned the chalice, but he knows more than he says. Hastings frowned. What about that sheen he mentioned? Sounds like he saw the cyanide, even if he won't admit it. Précisément, Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. He saw something, but his hesitation to speak suggests fear or calculation. We must verify his movements last night. The verger saw him near the church, but what was he truly doing? And this argument between Lyle and Father Edmund, it grows ever more significant. The scandal of the missing funds, the diverted bequest, these are the currents beneath the surface. They paused at the churchyard gate, where the tower of St. Mary's stood sentinel, its stones etched with centuries of secrets. Poirot's gaze lingered on the darkened windows, his mind weaving the threads of testimony and evidence. The antiquarian's motive, he murmured. It is not merely greed. It is knowledge, knowledge of the chalice's value, and perhaps of the secrets it guarded. We must dig deeper, Hastings, into the heart of St. Aldwyn's, where the truth lies hidden like a buried relic. With the sun climbing higher, casting long shadows across the village, Poirot's grey cells churned, sensing that the mystery of the shattered chalice was drawing closer to its unravelling. Chapter 9. The verger's testimony. The midday sun hung low over St. Aldwyn's, its pale light filtering through the bare branches of the churchyard yews, casting intricate shadows on the gravel path. Hercule Poirot, his bowler hat tilted just so, walked with Captain Hastings toward the verger's cottage, where Mr. Cobb, the silent observer of St. Mary's, awaited. The village was subdued, its usual bustle dampened by the weight of Father Edmund's death and the shattered chalice. The air carried a faint chill, laced with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, as if the village itself mourned the violation of its sacred heart. Poirot's cane tapped a deliberate rhythm, his green eyes sharp with the intensity of a man closing in on a hidden truth. Hastings, his hands thrust deep into his coat pockets, glanced at his friend. "This Cobb fellow, Poirot, he's been helpful so far, but do you really think he's got more to tell? He's just the verger, always pottering about, not exactly in the thick of things." Poirot's moustache curved in a faint smile. "Mon ami, it is precisely those who potter, as you say, who see what others overlook. Monsieur Cobb is the shadow in the background, unnoticed yet ever present. His eyes, they have seen the movements of our suspects, Lyle, Wentworth, Hargrove. His testimony, it may be the key to unlocking this puzzle." They reached the cottage, its stone walls weathered but sturdy, its door framed by a climbing rose, now barren in the autumn chill. Mr. Cobb opened it at their knock, his stooped figure clad in a worn cardigan, his face etched with the lines of a man who had seen too many sorrows. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Come in, sirs. I've been expecting you." He led them into the cramped parlour, where the fire burned low, its embers casting a soft glow over the cluttered table of parish records. Poirot settled into a chair, his posture impeccable, and fixed Cobb with a courteous but penetrating gaze. "Monsieur Cobb, you have been most helpful in shedding light on the shadows of a St. Mary's. Your observations of Deacon Lyle's argument with Father Edmund and of Madame Wentworth's concerns have been invaluable. But now I seek precision. The morning of the tragedy, you were in the church, tending the candles. Tell me, what did you see of our 3 suspects?" Cobb's hands trembled slightly as he poured tea, the pot clinking against the cups. "I don't like to speak out of turn, sir, but I'll tell you true. That morning I was in the nave early, lighting the candles and setting out the prayer books. Deacon Lyle was in the vestry with Father Edmund, preparing the chalice. I saw him come out just before the service, holding the chalice, polishing it, he said. But his hands were shaking. Something fierce. Looked like he hadn't slept a wink. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his fingers steepled. Shaking, you say? And the chalice. Did you notice anything unusual about it? A sheen, perhaps, or an odour? Cobb frowned, his brow furrowing as he searched his memory. No odour, sir, but now you mention it. The chalice did catch the light oddly, like it was greasy, maybe. I thought it was just the polish, but Lyle was quick to hand it to Father Edmund, like he didn't want to hold it long. He paused, his eyes clouding. I should have said something, but it didn't seem important then. Hastings leaned forward, his voice eager. That's the cyanide, Poirot. Lyle must have coated it right there in the vestry. He had the key, the opportunity. Everything fits. Poirot raised a finger, his expression cautionary. Patience, mon ami. A piece that fits too neatly is sometimes a distraction. Monsieur Cobb, continue. What of Madame Wentworth and Monsieur Hargrove? Cobb set down his cup, his hands steadying as he spoke. Mrs. Wentworth was in the vestry earlier, before Lyle. She was arranging hymnals, fussing over the altar linens, as she does. She's particular about the church being just so, on account of her husband's money keeping it standing. I saw her leave the vestry about 7:30, looking flustered. She didn't speak to Lyle, far as I saw, but she was muttering to herself something about keeping things proper. Poirot's moustache twitched, a sign of his growing interest. Flustered, you say? And did she return to the vestry before the ceremony began? Cobb shook his head. Not that I saw, sir. She took her place in the front pew, same as always. But I'll tell you something odd. She kept glancing at the vestry door during the service, like she was expecting someone to come out. Or maybe she was just nervous about the ceremony. Poirot's gaze was unrelenting. And Monsieur Hargrove. The stranger with an eye for relics. Where was he? Cobb's face darkened, his voice lowering. Hargrove was in the church just before the service started, sitting in the front pew, bold as brass. He'd been poking about all week, asking me questions about the chalice, its age, its markings, even how it was stored. I told him it was locked away, safe as houses, but he just smiled, like he knew something I didn't. That morning he was watching the altar close-like, especially when Lyle brought out the chalice. Didn't move a muscle when Father fell, just stared at the pieces on the floor. Hastings frowned, his hands clenching. Sounds like Hargrove was sizing up his chance. Maybe he planned to nick the chalice, and when Father Edmund caught him out, he resorted to poison. Poirot's smile was enigmatic. A possibility, Hastings. But poison is a subtle weapon, and Monsieur Hargrove, he prefers the shadows of negotiation. Let us consider another thread. Monsieur Cobb, you spoke of, a bequest from Madame Wentworth's husband, meant for an orphanage, but never delivered. Did Father Edmund ever mention this to you again, perhaps in connection with Deacon Lyle? Cobb's eyes widened slightly, as if surprised by the question. He did, sir, just a few days ago. I was cleaning the chancel, and Father was at the altar, praying. He looked troubled, said something about righting a wrong, and how the church had to be clean in God's eyes. I asked if it was about the bequest, and he nodded, but wouldn't say more, only that he'd spoken to Lyle about it, and Lyle was, well, he said Lyle was struggling with his conscience. Poirot's grey cells hummed, the pieces of the puzzle shifting in his mind. Struggling, you say? Most illuminating. And Madame Wentworth, did she ever speak of this bequest to you? Cobb hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of his Bible. Not directly, sir, but last week I overheard her at the vicarage, talking to Father Edmund. She was upset, said something about Reginald's name mustn't be tarnished. Father tried to calm her, said he'd handle it discreetly, but she left in a huff. I reckon she was afraid of gossip, her being so proud of her husband's legacy. Hastings whistled softly. That's it, Poirot. The bequest's the key. If Father Edmund was digging into where that money went, and Lyle was involved, it explains everything. Lyle's nerves, Wentworth's defensiveness, even Hargrove's interest if he got wind of a scandal. Poirot's expression was serene but resolute. Oui, mon ami. The bequest is a thread that binds our suspects, but it is not the whole tapestry. The chalice, it was poisoned with care, shattered with purpose. We must ask, who feared exposure most? Lyle, with his trembling hands? Wentworth, with her pride? Or Hargrove, whose motives remain cloaked in shadow? He rose, tipping his hat to Cobb. Merci, monsieur. Your memory, it is a lantern in the dark. We shall not trouble you further today. As they stepped back into the churchyard, the sun had climbed higher, its light glinting off the church's stained glass windows. Hastings shook his head. "Cobb's testimony puts Lyle right in the frame, Poirot." He was shaking, holding the chalice, and Father Edmund was onto him about the funds. "It's as clear as day." Poirot's cane tapped the gravel, his voice low. "Clear, perhaps, but the truth, it is like the mist. It shifts when you approach. Lyle's fear, it is real, but is it the fear of a murderer or a man trapped by circumstance? We must confirm Hargrove's movements, and Madame Wentworth's agitation over the bequest. It suggests a secret she guards fiercely. The verger's testimony, it is a step closer, but the final piece awaits." They turned toward the village, the tower of St. Mary's looming behind them, its ancient stones silent witnesses to a crime that Poirot's grey cells were determined to. Unravel. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Aldwyn's, its rays filtering through the ancient stained-glass windows of St. Mary's Church, painting the stone floor with patches of crimson and azure. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of wax and the lingering echo of tragedy. Hercule Poirot had requested a gathering in the nave, a sombre assembly of those entwined in the mystery of Father Edmund's death and the Shattered Chalice. The pews, usually filled with worshippers, now held only 3 figures. Mrs. Clara Wentworth, her black dress a stark contrast to the light. Deacon Thomas Lyle, his hands fidgeting with his rosary. And Victor Hargrove, lounging with an air of detached curiosity. Captain Hastings stood by the vestry door, his honest face tense, while Inspector Grayson, his moustache bristling with impatience, leaned against a pillar, watching Poirot with grudging anticipation. Poirot stood before the altar, his small frame commanding the space with an authority born of intellect. His green eyes swept over the trio, his voice calm but resonant, cutting through the silence like a bell. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his French accent lending a melodic cadence, "we are gathered here, in this sacred place, to confront a most heinous crime. The murder of Father Edmund, a man of faith, poisoned by cyanide upon the chalice he revered. The chalice, now shattered, was not merely a relic, but a symbol of truth. And it is truth that Hercule Poirot seeks today." Mrs. Wentworth's lips tightened, her hands clutching her prayer book, as if it were a shield. Lyle's head bowed, his rosary beads clicking nervously. Hargrove's smile was faint, his eyes narrowing as if weighing Poirot's words. Hastings, ever loyal, whispered, "Here we go, Poirot. Lay it on them." Poirot raised a gloved hand, silencing the murmurs. "Let us begin with the facts. The chalice was coated with cyanide, applied with a cloth found in the vestry, hidden beneath a hymn book. A vial, also bearing traces of cyanide, was discovered nearby. The poison was placed on the chalice's rim in the vestry, moments before the ceremony, by someone with access to the cabinet's key. This narrows our circle to 3. Madame Wentworth, who was in the vestry arranging hymnals, Monsieur Lyle, who held the key and prepared the chalice, and Monsieur Hargrove, whose presence near the church raises questions." Mrs. Wentworth's voice cut in, sharp and indignant. "Monsieur Poirot, I have told you I touched nothing but hymnals. I would never defile the chalice or harm Father Edmund. My husband's legacy is tied to this church. His honor is mine." Poirot's gaze was gentle but unyielding. "Madame, your devotion is clear, but so is your fear. You spoke to Father Edmund last week, urging him to keep a matter buried for Reginald's sake. A bequest, meant for an orphanage, never reached its destination. Father Edmund was investigating this, was he not? Did you fear his inquiries would tarnish your husband's name? Her face paled, but she held his gaze. Reginald's bequest was a private matter. I pressed father to be discreet, yes, but I had no part in his death. I was in my pew when the chalice was brought out. Ask anyone. Poirot nodded, turning to Lyle, whose hands trembled visibly. Monsieur Lyle, you held the key to the cabinet. You polished the chalice, handed it to Father Edmund. The verger saw you, shaking, as if burdened by more than duty. You argued with Father Edmund about trust, about church funds that were misplaced. Did he discover something you could not bear to have exposed? Lyle's voice was barely a whisper, his eyes fixed on the floor. I told you, it was a misunderstanding. The funds, a small sum, for candles, it was a clerical error. Father believed me. I'd never hurt him. He was like a father to me. His voice broke, and he clutched the rosary tighter, as if seeking salvation in its beads. Hargrove's laugh, soft and mocking, broke the tension. Really, Monsieur Poirot, you're barking up the wrong tree. Lyle's a nervous wreck, and Mrs. Wentworth's too proud to get her hands dirty. I'm just a visitor, here for the chalice's history. If anyone had motive, it's Lyle. He had the key, the access, and a reason to silence the priest. Poirot's eyes gleamed, his voice sharp as a blade. Monsieur Hargrove, your interest in the chalice was not merely historical. You inquired about its value on the black market, did you not? You were seen near the church after dark, perhaps seeking a way to acquire it. Did Father Edmund's refusal to part with it drive you to desperate measures? Hargrove's smile faltered, but he leaned back, his tone cool. I'm a businessman, not a murderer. Yes, I explored the chalice's worth, but I never touched it. I was in the pews, watching, like everyone else. Lyle's the one who handed it over, shaking like a leaf. Look to him. Poirot paced slowly before the altar, his cane tapping softly. Let us reconstruct the morning. The chalice was in the vestry, locked until Deacon Lyle prepared it. Madame Wentworth was there earlier, arranging hymnals, with access to the cabinet if the key was left unattended. Monsieur Hargrove, you entered the church just before the service, your eyes fixed on the chalice. The poison was applied in the vestry, in a narrow window of time. But the shattering of the chalice, that was no accident. It was a deliberate act to destroy evidence of the cyanide's residue. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the trio. But the motive, it is not merely about the chalice. It is about a scandal, a secret that threatened to unravel lives. The bequest of Reginald Wentworth, meant for an orphanage, was diverted. Stolen, perhaps. Father Edmund discovered this, and his inquiries stirred fear. Madame Wentworth, you feared disgrace too. Your husband's name. Monsieur Hargrove, you saw an opportunity in the chaos. But Monsieur Lyle... Poirot turned to the deacon, his voice soft but commanding. You, monsieur, were the one Father Edmund confronted. He discovered you had forged documents to cover personal debts using the church's funds. The clerical error was a lie, was it not? Lyle's face crumpled, his voice a sob. No, I borrowed the money, yes, but I meant to pay it back. Father found out, said he'd report me unless I confessed. I couldn't face the shame, but I didn't kill him. I swear it. Mrs. Wentworth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Hargrove's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent. Grayson stepped forward, his voice gruff. That's a confession, Poirot. Lyle had the motive, the means, the opportunity. He's our man. Poirot raised a hand, his expression serene but resolute. Not yet, Inspector. Monsieur Lyle's guilt is clear, but not of murder. The poison, it was applied with care, the chalice shattered to conceal it. Lyle's panic, it is real, but his hands, they tremble too much for such precision. No, the killer is one who planned, who calculated, and I, Hercule Poirot, have seen the truth. He turned to the trio, his voice rising. The killer is among you, but it is not enough to suspect. The evidence, the cloth, the vial, the chalice's sheen, it points to one whose motive was not greed or pride, but fear of exposure. Tomorrow we shall gather again, and the truth will be revealed. As the suspects dispersed, Lyle weeping, Wentworth indignant, and Hargrove impassive, Hastings shook his head. You've got them rattled, Poirot, but I'm still betting on Lyle. He's admitted to the theft. Poirot's smile was enigmatic. The theft, oui, but the murder? No, mon ami. The chalice's destruction. It was a desperate act, and desperation is the mark of our killer. Come, let us prepare for the final act in this sacred drama. The church fell silent, its ancient stones holding the weight of secrets soon to be unveiled, as Poirot's grey cells worked tirelessly toward the truth. Chapter 11. The Confession. The morning light streamed through the stained-glass windows of St. Mary's Church, casting a mosaic of colours across the stone floor, where the memory of the shattered chalice lingered like a wound. Hercule Poirot stood once more before the altar, his small frame radiating an authority that had belied his stature. His bowler hat rested on a pew, his gloved hands clasped over his cane, and his green eyes gleamed with the certainty of a man who had unravelled the threads of a complex tapestry. Captain Hastings stood to his right, his face a mixture of anticipation and unease, while Inspector Grayson, his moustache bristling with impatience, flanked him on the left. The three suspects, Mrs. Clara Wentworth, Deacon Thomas Lyle, and Victor Hargrove, sat in the front pews, their expressions a study in contrast. Wentworth's rigid with defiance, Lyle's crumpled with despair, and Hargrove's coolly detached. Poirot's voice, clear and resonant, filled the nave. Mesdames et messieurs, we stand in this sacred place to bring light to a darkness that has claimed a good man's life. Father Edmund was poisoned, the chalice he revered coated with cyanide and shattered to conceal the crime. But Hercule Poirot, he does not permit the truth to remain hidden. The evidence, the cloth, the vial, the chalice's sheen has spoken, and today the killer will be named. Mrs. Wentworth's hands tightened on her prayer book, her voice sharp. Monsieur Poirot, I have endured your insinuations long enough. My husband's legacy is untarnished, and I had no part in this horror. Name your culprit and be done with it. Lyle, his face ashen, clutched his rosary, his voice barely audible. I've told you everything. I took the money, yes, but I didn't kill him. Please, you must believe me. Hargrove leaned back, his smile faint but mocking. A fine performance, Monsieur Poirot, but I'm merely a bystander. The chalice was a curiosity, nothing more. Look to Lyle. He's the one with the guilty conscience. Poirot raised a hand, silencing them with a gesture. Let us begin with the crime itself. The chalice was poisoned in the vestry, moments before the ceremony, with cyanide applied to its rim using a cloth. A vial, hidden beneath a hymn book, held the poison. The chalice was then shattered, not by accident, but to obscure the evidence of the cyanide's residue. This was a crime of precision, of desperation, committed by one who feared exposure above all else. He turned to Mrs. Wentworth, his gaze gentle but unyielding. "Madame, your pride in your husband's legacy is fierce. The bequest for the orphanage, diverted and never delivered, was a shadow on that legacy. Father Edmund's inquiries threatened to expose this, did they not? You urged him to keep it buried, for Reginald's sake. But you were in the vestry that morning, alone, with access to the chalice if the key was left unguarded." Wentworth's face flushed, but her voice was steady. "I told you, I touched only hymnals. I was in my pew when the chalice was brought out. My concern was for my husband's name, not murder. Father Edmund promised discretion. I trusted him." Poirot nodded, turning to Hargrove. "Monsieur Hargrove, your interest in the chalice was far from scholarly. You sought its value on the black market, a prize to be sold to the highest bidder. You were near the church the night before, perhaps seeking a way to steal it. Did Father Edmund's refusal to part with it drive you to eliminate him?" Hargrove's smile was icy. "You're reaching, Monsieur Poirot. I'm a businessman, not a killer. I was in the pews, watching, like everyone else. Lyle handled the chalice last. His hands were shaking, his guilt plain as day." Poirot's eyes gleamed as he turned to Lyle, whose head was bowed, his rosary beads clicking frantically. "Monsieur Lyle, you held the key to the cabinet. You polished the chalice, handed it to Father Edmund. You admitted to forging documents to cover personal debts, a scandal Father Edmund discovered. His threat to expose you was a weight you could not bear, non." Lyle's voice broke, a sob escaping his lips. "I couldn't face the shame. Father was going to report me, ruin me. I borrowed the money, yes, but I meant to pay it back. I didn't poison him, I swear. I broke the chalice, yes, but only after he fell. I panicked, thought it might hide what happened." He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking. A gasp rippled through the nave. Wentworth's eyes widened, Hargrove's smile vanished, and Grayson stepped forward, his voice gruff. "That's it, Poirot. Lyle's admitted to breaking the chalice. He's our man. Motive, means, everything." Poirot's voice cut through the tension, calm but commanding. "Non, Inspector. Monsieur Lyle's confession is truthful, but it is not complete. He broke the chalice in panic, yes, to obscure the poison's trace. But the poison itself? That was the work of another. Someone with steady hands, a calculating mind, and a motive deeper than theft or pride." He paced before the altar, his cane tapping softly. "Let us reconstruct the truth. The cyanide was applied in the vestry within a narrow window of time. Lyle, you were there, preparing the chalice, but your hands, they tremble too much for such precision. Madame Wentworth, your presence in the vestry was brief, and your alibi, though solitary, is supported by the verger's testimony. Monsieur Hargrove, you were not in the vestry, but your knowledge of the chalice's value suggests a motive. Yet murder is not your style." Poirot paused, his gaze sweeping over the trio. "The killer is one who knew Father Edmund's habits, who had access to cyanide, and who feared exposure above all else. The bequest, the church funds, these were distractions, threads to confuse. The true motive was personal, a secret so damning it drove the killer to act. And that killer is you, Monsieur Lyle." Lyle's head snapped up, his face a mask of terror. "No! I told you I didn't poison him. I broke the chalice, yes, but only after—" Poirot's voice was relentless. "You broke the chalice to hide your crime, monsieur. You stole cyanide from the local chemist, where you were seen purchasing supplies last week. You applied it to the chalice's rim, knowing Father Edmund would drink. When he fell, you shattered the chalice in a desperate bid to destroy the evidence. Your panic, it was not merely guilt over the funds, it was the fear of a murderer caught in his own trap." Lyle collapsed, sobbing. "I couldn't let him ruin me. The debts, the shame. Father was going to expose me, tell the bishop. I thought, one sip, and it would be over. I didn't mean for it to go this far." His confession echoed in the nave, a raw admission of guilt. Wentworth's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. Hargrove's face was impassive, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of relief. Grayson stepped forward, handcuffs in hand. "That's enough, Lyle. You're coming with us." As the constable led Lyle away, his sobs fading into the churchyard, Hastings shook his head. "Poor devil, driven to murder over a few pounds. But you had him pegged, Poirot." Poirot's expression was sombre. "Not pounds, mon ami, but a pride and fear. Monsieur Lyle's heart was weak, and fear made it weaker still. The chalice, it was his undoing, as it was Father Edmund's." He turned to Wentworth, his voice gentle. "Madame, your husband's legacy is safe, but it was your fear of its taint that clouded the truth. And Monsieur Hargrove, your greed was a distraction, but not a crime." Hargrove rose, tipping his hat. "A fine show, Monsieur Poirot. I'll be leaving Sant. Aldwin's now. The chalice is no longer worth my time." As the nave emptied, Poirot stood alone by the altar, his gaze on the spot where the chalice had shattered. "The human heart," he murmured. "It is fragile, like the chalice, and so easily broken by fear." Chapter 12. The Restored Order. The sun dipped low over St. Aldwyn's, casting a warm amber glow across the village, where the thatched roofs and cobblestone lanes seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief. The tragedy of Father Edmund's death and the shattering of the sacred chalice had left a wound in the heart of the community. But with Deacon Thomas Lyle's confession, a semblance of clarity had begun to heal the rift. Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings stood on the platform of the village's modest railway station, their bags packed, awaiting the train that would carry them back to the bustle of London. The air was crisp, laced with the scent of autumn leaves and the faint tolling of Saint. Mary's bell now ringing not in mourning, but in a quiet promise of renewal. Poirot, his bowler hat tilted precisely, adjusted his gloves with a fastidious touch, his green eyes reflecting the fading light. "Mon ami," he said to Hastings, his voice soft but resonant. "The case of the broken chalice, it is concluded, yet it leaves a lesson in the heart of Hercule Poirot. The sacred, it is not in relics alone, but in the truth we seek to honor them." Hastings, his honest face creased with a mix of admiration and lingering unease, shifted his suitcase to his other hand. "You've done it again, Poirot. Unraveled the whole tangle. Lyle's theft, his fear, the poison. But I can't help feeling for the poor chap. Driven to murder over a moment of weakness? It's a grim business." Poirot's moustache twitched, a faint smile playing beneath it. "Oui, Hastings, grim indeed. Monsieur Lyle's weakness was not merely in his theft, but in his surrender to fear. He saw no path but desperation, and in that desperation he destroyed not only Father Edmund, but the very relic he swore to protect. The chalice, it was a mirror to his soul. Beautiful, yet so easily shattered. The station platform was quiet, save for the distant whistle of the approaching train. Beyond the tracks, the spire of St. Mary's rose against the horizon, its stones bathed in the golden light. Poirot's gaze lingered there, his mind retracing the threads of the case. Consider, mon ami, the motives we uncovered. Madame Wentworth, her pride was a shield, guarding the shadow of her husband's misdeeds. The bequest, diverted from its purpose, was a secret she feared would tarnish her legacy. Yet her heart was true. She sought only to protect, not to destroy. Hastings nodded, his brow furrowing. And Hargrove, what a slippery sort. All that talk of antiquities, when he was really after the chalice's price on the black market. Hamish, do you think he'd have tried to steal it if Lyle hadn't acted first? Poirot's smile was enigmatic. Perhaps, Hastings, but Monsieur Hargrove is a man of calculation, not violence. His interest was in profit, not murder. He saw opportunity in the chaos, but the poison, it was not his handiwork. No, the truth lay with Lyle, whose fear of exposure drove him to a sin greater than theft. The train's whistle grew louder, its steam curling into the air as it rounded the bend. Poirot continued, his voice low but clear. The chalice, it was more than a relic. To Madame Wentworth, it was a symbol of her husband's honour. To Hargrove, a prize to be sold. To Lyle, a reminder of his failure. And to Father Edmund, a vessel of faith, poisoned by the very hand he trusted. The shattering of the chalice was Lyle's final act of panic, but it could not hide the truth from the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot. Hastings chuckled, shaking his head. You make it sound so simple, Poirot. But I was half convinced it was Wentworth or Hargrove until you laid it all out. That business with the bequest threw me. Thought it was the key to the whole thing. Poirot's eyes twinkled. The bequest, it was a distraction, mon ami, a thread that seemed to lead to motive, but was merely a shadow. The true motive was Lyle's fear. Fear of disgrace, of losing his place in the church he served. The cyanide, stolen from the chemist, was his weapon. The cloth and vial, his tools. The shattered chalice, his futile attempt to erase his crime. But the truth, it is like the sun. It cannot be hidden forever. As the train pulled into the station, its brakes hissing, a figure approached from the direction of the church. Mrs. Wentworth, her black dress softened by a shawl, walked with a measured grace, her face pale but composed. She carried a small parcel wrapped in cloth, and her eyes met Poirot's with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Monsieur Poirot, she said, her voice steady, I heard you were leaving. I wish to thank you. The truth, painful as it is, has spared my husband's name. The bequest, it was a mistake, not theft, and Father Edmund knew it. I feared the worst, but you've restored order. Poirot bowed, his hat in hand. Madame, the truth is a balm, even when it stings. The fragments of the chalice, they are being gathered, to be restored, as a symbol of resilience. She nodded, her fingers tightening on the parcel. Yes, the silversmith in Gloucester will repair it as best he can. It will never be the same, but it will stand again, a reminder of faith enduring. She hesitated, then added, I misjudged you, monsieur. Your clarity, it has brought peace to St. Aldwyn's. Poirot's smile was gentle. Peace, madame, is the goal of Hercule Poirot. Go with grace, and let the church heal. As she turned back toward the village, the train's doors opened, and passengers began to board. Hastings glanced at Poirot, his expression thoughtful. You know, Poirot, I thought this village would be a restful break, but it's been anything but. Still, you've worked your magic again. Lyle's behind bars. Wentworth's legacy is safe, and Hargroves slunk off with his tail between his legs. Poirot's eyes twinkled as he stepped onto the train, his cane tapping lightly. Magic, Hastings? No, it is method. The method of observation, of logic, of the little grey cells. The heart of St. Aldwyn's was wounded, but it beats still. And we, mon ami, we return to London, where new puzzles await. The train lurched forward, its wheels clattering on the tracks as the village receded into the distance. St. Mary's bell tolled once more, a solemn farewell, and Poirot settled into his seat, his mind already turning to the mysteries that lay beyond the horizon, confident that no secret could withstand the relentless pursuit of truth.